Thank you for joining us and welcome to this virtual meeting of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm Jennifer Homendy and I'm honored to serve as chair of the NTSB. Joining us today are my colleagues on the board, Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg, Member Michael Graham, and Member Tom Chapman. Today we meet in open session as required by the government in the Sunshine Act to consider the hazardous liquid pipeline strike and subsequent explosion and fire aboard the dredging vessel Waymon Boyd on August 21st, 2020. The pipeline strike, explosion, and fire occurred at the Epic Marine Terminal in the Corpus Christi ship channel in Corpus Christi, Texas. Tragically, 3 crew members aboard the Waymon Boyd and 1 crew member on an adjacent anchor barge died in the explosion and fire. 6 crew members aboard the dredge were seriously injured, one of whom later died from his injuries. Hablo un poco de español y quisiera enviarle un mensaje a las familias y amigos de los trabajadores de Orion Marine Group. En nombre de todos nosotros, en NTSB, ofrezco mis más profundas condolencias a aquellos que se vieron afectados por esta tragedia. Hoy puede ser un día muy difícil para ustedes. Realmente lamentamos todo lo que están pasando. Nuestros corazones están con todos y cada uno de ustedes. I only speak a little Spanish, but it's important for us as a board to connect with all loved ones to the best of our abilities. What I said was, on behalf of all of us at the NTSB, I offer my deepest sympathies to those who were impacted by this tragedy. Today may be a very difficult day for you. We are truly sorry for all that you're going through, and our hearts go out to each and every one of you. Please know that all those involved with this investigation have worked to ensure that everything that could be learned from this event was uncovered. Our goal today is to ensure that the lessons learned in this tragedy and the actions that can be taken to prevent such a tragedy from happening again are captured in our report and safety recommendations. To that end, each board member has studied the draft report and met individually with the investigative team. But today's board meeting is the first time that we've gathered as a board to discuss the report. Today, staff will present the pertinent facts and analysis and summarize what they found. After each presentation, we on the board will discuss the key safety issues brought to light during the investigation, issue by issue, and then staff will propose the findings, probable cause, and safety recommendations for board consideration. The public docket for this investigation was released on October 13th, 2021, and contains nearly 2,800 pages of additional relevant material and is available on our website at www.ntsb.gov. The final report will also be available on our website in just a few weeks, once any amendments voted upon today are incorporated and the report is finalized for release. Before I invite each of my colleagues on the board to introduce themselves, I'd like to take a moment to thank the United States Coast Guard and the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration for their work on this investigation and for our continued partnership to improve marine and pipeline safety. We've worked together on many investigations. Your role in those investigations is critical, and I look forward to continuing to work together to save lives. Now let's turn to the introductions. Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg.
Good morning, Chair, and good morning to fellow board members and to our staff. I look forward to our discussion today.
Good morning. Member Graham.
Good morning, Chair, Vice Chair, Member Chapman, and staff. Looking forward to today, and I want to let the staff know I really appreciate a very excellent and thorough draft report.
Well said. Member Chapman.
Good morning, Chair and board colleagues, and I join in congratulating our team for an outstanding job in this investigation.
Thank you very much. I'll now ask Deputy Managing Director for Investigations, Brian Curtis, to introduce our colleagues who will be participating in today's meeting. Good morning, Mr. Curtis.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair Homendy. I'd also like to thank everyone who helped make this virtual board meeting happen today. My only administrative announcement this morning is a reminder for the meeting participants to silence all their electronic devices. I'll now introduce staff for today's meeting. Morgan Terrell, Director for the Office of Marine Safety. Luke Wisniewski, Investigator in Charge. Drew Ellers, Nautical Operations. Mike Huff, System Safety and Human Performance. Paul Stansel, Pipeline Operations. Frank Zakar, Materials Engineering. Dr. Mary Pat McKay, Medical Officer. Eric Emery, Safety Research. Rebecca Martini, Writer-Editor. Kathleen Silba, General Counsel for the NTSB. Catherine Catania, Deputy Director for the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Robert Hall, Director for the Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials Investigations. Jim Ritter, Director for the Office of Research and Engineering. Eric Stolzenberg, Deputy Director for the Office of Marine Safety. Liam LaRue, Chief of Marine Investigations. Rob Jones, Deputy Chief of Marine Investigations. Mike Badinsky, Chief of the Materials Laboratory. Sean Lynham, Chief of Pipeline and Hazardous Materials. Bob Beaton, Chief of System Safety. Scott Rainey, Safety Recommendations. The presentations will begin with an investigation overview by the investigator in charge, Luke Wisniewski. Mr. Wisniewski.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Good morning, Chair Homendy, Vice Chairman Landsberg, members Graham and Chapman. This morning, staff will present our investigation of the hazardous liquid pipeline strike and subsequent explosion and fire aboard the dredging vessel Waymon Boyd that occurred in Corpus Christi, Texas on August 21st, 2020. In addition to those who are participating in today's meeting, I would like to acknowledge the staff noted here for their support and assistance during the investigation and report development. I would also like to acknowledge staff noted here who produced this virtual board meeting. NTSB was the lead federal agency for this investigation. Parties to the investigation are listed here, and we would like to thank them for their assistance throughout the investigation. The accident occurred at the Epic Marine Terminal in the inner harbor of Corpus Christi Ship Channel, illustrated here by the red triangle. In 2019, Epic Crude Terminal Company repurposed the former Interstate Grain Terminal, West Dock, to be capable of loading crude oil to medium-sized tank vessels. Later that year, Epic began planning for a second crude oil dock to the east. The new berth and dock, labeled Future East Dock and highlighted in yellow shaded area of the image above, required construction of a bulkhead along the shoreline and dredging of a new ship berth between the dock and main shipping channel. Orion Marine Group, a subsidiary of Orion Group Holdings, a heavy civil marine construction company, was selected by Epic to construct East Dock and dredge the associated berth. The marine construction and dredging operations were contracted separately and undertaken by different divisions within Orion. Schneider Engineering and Consulting, a wholly owned subsidiary of Orion Marine Group, developed the dredging construction plan for Epic's East Dock, which will be discussed later in greater detail by Mr. Ellers. The non-propelled 152-foot-long cutter suction dredge Waymon Boyd was used for EPIC dredging project. Waymon Boyd operated 24 hours a day in 2 12-hour shifts. During normal 12-hour shifts, the dredge and its attendant barges and supporting vessels were crewed by 17 to 19 personnel. Hazardous liquid transmission pipeline TX219, shown here by a yellow dotted line, was an intrastate pipeline owned and operated by the subsidiaries of Enterprise Products Partners, LP. The pipeline connected Flint Hills Refinery on the left side of the image to a propane storage facility at Origin Station, depicted in the lower right side of the image. Near the accident location, the pipe was coated with a coal tar and a 2-inch thick exterior concrete coating. The pipeline was constructed in 1968. The breech pipe had a 16-inch outside diameter. The pipeline pressure was 257 pounds per inch square gauge at the time of the accident. In the early morning of July 29th, the Waymon Boyd was towed in position at EPIC's East Dock site, and dredging began later that day. Throughout the first weeks of August, the Waymon Boyd operated at the dredge site as shown here, a few days before the accident, working generally east to west, beginning on the channel side and moving progressively inshore. On the morning of August 21st, a total of 18 personnel employed by Orion were working or resting on the dredge and assist boats that included tender boats, anchor barges, booster barges, and a supply barge. The dredge was working in an area between 2 existing mooring dolphins located on the western side of the project, annotated here by the white arrows in the center of the image. On August 21st, about 8:02 a.m. Central Daylight Time, TX219 was struck by the Waymon Boyd's rotating cutter head, causing a breach in the line that allowed propane gas to escape and form a gas cloud that surrounded the dredge. EPIC's marine terminal security camera footage that I will now play for you captured the initial breach of the pipeline and the eruption of water and gas, the initial explosion and ensuing fireball that made its way up to the green terminal. For reference, the security camera is looking west at EPIC's West Dock. Waymon Boyd is just outside of view of the camera on the right-hand side, center line of the frame. A portion of the video prior to the explosion has been sped up to reduce the length of the video. I will pause before starting to allow those that do not wish to view to look away. The video is 76 seconds in length. Viewers' discretion is advised. Please start the video. The surface winds were from the southwest, as indicated by the white smokestack emissions in the background. Notice the direction of travel of propane gas toward the grain elevators. You'll notice the shaking of the camera at the initial explosion. The video has ended. Apologies, the video is not ended. The video has ended. Staff believes propane gas that had released from the pipeline TX219 was drawn into the Waymon Boyd's engine room by the ventilation fans and was ignited, causing the explosion. Here's an image from the Coast Guard's helicopter search and rescue overflight when arriving on scene shortly after the accident that depicts the size of the fire and damage to the vessel and surrounding shoreline and terminal. 3 crew members aboard the Waymon Boyd and 1 on the adjacent anchor barge died in the explosion and fire. 6 crew members aboard the Dredge were seriously injured. First responders located the injured and transported them to local hospitals. They were eventually transferred to burn units in San Antonio, Texas, where one of the crew members later died of his injuries. The cost of pipeline damage was $2.09 million. Waymon Boyd, valued at $9.48 million, was a total loss. Cost of physical damage to the EPIC facility was $120,000. A 14-foot segment of the damaged pipe, along with 3 cutter head teeth, were sent to NTSB Materials Laboratory in Washington, D.C. for examination and concluded the pipe had 5 gouges, 3 dents, and 2 punctures from contact with the cutter head. The gouge and puncture damage occurred near the 7 o'clock position on the bottom side of the pipe when looking east. Staff concluded the following items listed here were determined to not be safety issues for this accident. Staff will present the following safety focus areas for this accident to include dredging operations, construction plans, DredgePack, the software application used aboard the Waymon Boyd, training, project planning and risk assessment, and pipeline damage prevention. This concludes my presentation. Mr. Ehlers will now discuss nautical operations.
Good morning, Chair Homendy, Vice Chairman Landsberg, and members of the board. I will be presenting the nautical operations aspects of this accident. The 2020 dredging operations for the EPIC East Dock project were based on engineering plans developed by Schneider Engineering and Consulting, the engineering design subsidiary of Orion Group Holdings. The first drawing in the Schneider engineering plans, titled Existing Site Plan, showed a satellite image of the project area. The plan included an outline of the 46.5-foot deep berth that was to be dredged, as well as 3 pipelines that ran along the shoreline. The location data for the pipelines had been provided by Schneider to Schneider via Orion by the site owner EPIC and were based on a 2018 utilities survey. The most northerly of the pipelines was TX219, the accident pipeline. The plan did not show no-go areas, also known as tolerance zones, around the pipelines. This area southward of the berth that was to be dredged on a slope was also not depicted in the drawing. The next drawing in the Schneider plans, titled Dredge Site Plan, showed a line diagram of the project area. The plan included the outline of the berth that was to be dredged and also showed a partial depiction of the sloped area to be dredged. However, the slope was not shown in the area of a proposed bulkhead. This bulkhead had not been constructed at the time of the accident. The pipelines that had been shown in the existing site plan were not shown in this drawing or any of the remaining drawings in the full set of plans. Thus, there was no drawing which showed both the pipelines and the full extent of the dredging area, including the slope. In the plan legend, which was in the lower right corner of the dredge site plan, the shaded area in the drawing was labeled dredge limits. However, in the drawing, only the berth was shaded and not the slope that was to be dredged. A table with geographic coordinates was also located in the lower right corner of the dredge site plan. Although the table was labeled dredge limit coordinates, The points in the table once again marked the berth area only and not the full extent of the dredging area, which included both the berth and the slope. Staff found that the plans for the Epic Dock project did not clearly reflect the proximity of the pipeline to the full dredging area. This was because the Schneider Engineering and Consulting did not have company specifications, quality control measures, or best practices for including pipeline hazards and tolerance zones in their plans. As a result of this finding, staff proposes that Orion Group Holdings require their subsidiary company, Schneider Engineering and Consulting, to develop specifications and quality control measures to ensure pipeline and other hazard data is included and clearly represented in engineering plans and drawings, to include depicting tolerance distances from underwater hazards. Mr. Stansel will further discuss the Epic Dock plans and factors relating to the accident during his presentation. The operator of a dredge, known as a leverman, cannot see the cutter head he or she is controlling or the surface being excavated. Therefore, the leverman uses a computer application to provide a virtual display of the digging tool and dredging area. The application used aboard the Waymon Boyd was called DredgePack. DredgePack can be used by a leverman to determine in real time the position of the cutter head and the boundaries of the dredging area, also known as the dredge template. The image on the right is an example of a DredgePack display. DredgePack is also capable of displaying hazards such as pipelines, as well as tolerance zones around those hazards. Having accurate pipeline location data incorporated into DredgePack or other navigation software on board a dredge is critical to avoiding pipeline strikes and other potential hazards. However, Orion had no written procedures requiring pipelines or other utilities be entered into DredgePack. Although Epic provided location data for pipeline TX219 to Orion before dredging began, Orion did not include the data in the DredgePack dredge template used aboard the Waymon Boyd. Consequently, the Waymon Boyd leverman had nothing in DredgePack to indicate the danger he faced on the morning of the accident. Above and beyond the use of DredgePack, the investigation uncovered that Orion Marine Group did not have any written procedures or policies for planning dredging operations near pipelines. These policies and procedures could have enabled the company and its personnel to establish effective pipeline damage prevention measures and share them among key employees involved in the Epic Dock project. Staff found that Orion Marine Group did not have adequate procedures to require that pipelines be identified and included in DredgePack software. Thus, the Waymon Boyd's leverman was unaware how close he was operating to the cutter head to the pipeline. Further, staff found that overall, written policies and procedures could have eliminated confusion about the pipeline TX219 location and minimum tolerance distances for pipeline damage prevention. Thus, staff proposes that Orion Group Holdings require Orion Marine Group to develop standardized written procedures and policies for planning dredging operations near pipelines that include pipeline operator engagement on pipeline avoidance measures, minimum tolerance zones, minimum requirements for marking and verifying pipelines, and uploading of pipeline information into DredgePack or other navigation software. The leverman told investigators that just before the accident, the dredge cutter head was near the top of the slope in the dredging area and fully within the boundary of the template. However, staff determined that at the location of the breach, pipeline TX219 was about 1 foot outside the dredge template. The Waymon Boyd cutter head was over 100 feet from the operator, turning below the water surface, and the leverman was reliant on DredgePack software to position the 2.9-ton digging apparatus. The accuracy of the cutter head location, as displayed to the leverman on his DredgePack computer, was dependent on several factors. GPS location data fed into the system had a designed accuracy of 1 meter or 3.3 feet. Further, the position of the cutter head relative to the GPS antenna was dependent on the accuracy of dimension and depth information manually and automatically entered into DredgePack. Accuracy was further influenced by the resolution of the DredgePack display screen and the symbology in the software. Describing the accuracy of dredging operations, the Orion project manager told the NTSB, "It's not scalpel surgery," a sentiment that was repeated by a representative of DredgePack software developer. Although the pipeline was outside of the dredge template by about 1 foot, the margin of error for GPS alone could have put the cutter head within striking distance of the pipeline. If GPS error was exacerbated by other positional errors, the probability is even greater that the Waymon Boyd's cutterhead could be operating outside the planned dredging area while still appearing to be within the dredge template in DredgePack. The DredgePack template was based on the engineering plans for the project. Thus, staff found that given the GPS margin of error, potential inaccuracies in the dredging configuration information, and the resolution of the DredgePack display, the dredging area specified in the Schneider Engineering and Consulting plans was too close to pipeline TX219 for safe excavation using a cutterhead dredge. The Council for Dredging and Marine Construction Safety, abbreviated CDMCS, is an organization whose stated purpose is to create an injury-free workplace and safety-first culture for the dredging and marine construction industry. In January 2020, 8 months before the accident, CDMCS published a best practices guide for safe dredging and construction activities near underwater gas and hazardous liquid pipelines. Contained within the guidance were recommended actions for dredge crews in the event of a pipeline strike. These actions included immediately stopping all operations, shutting down or minimizing the use of possible ignition sources, accounting for the crew, informing them of the dangers, and evacuating the vessel if needed. Although Orion Marine Group was a member of CDMCS, the company did not train its crews in these recommended actions and did not have an emergency procedure for a pipeline strike. Consequently, when the Waymon Boyd struck the TX219, the leverman did not secure sources of ignition, inform the crew, or order an evacuation, actions which may have delayed the explosion. Staff found that prior to the accident, the Waymon Boyd crew lacked function-specific pipeline safety training and emergency procedures that could have prepared them to react quicker and more effectively to the gas pipeline strike. After the accident, Orion addressed this issue by instituting semi-annual utilities awareness training, which includes emergency procedures in the event of an accident. Additionally, emergency procedures in the event of a pipeline strike have been integrated into periodic fire and abandoned ship drills conducted on Orion dredges. Staff believes that the entire dredging industry would benefit from training on utilities awareness and emergency procedures in the event of a pipeline strike. This need can be addressed through an interactive online pipeline safety training course developed by the Coastal and Marine Operators Pipeline Industry Initiative, or CAMO, titled Working Safely Near Underwater Pipelines. The course covers topics such as planning steps for pipeline and marine construction personnel, project design implementation, pipeline avoidance, and daily safety and emergency checklists. This CAMO training would be further enhanced by the use of examples and lessons learned from the Waymon Boyd pipeline strike and explosion. Therefore, staff proposes that CAMO modify the existing online pipeline safety training to incorporate lessons learned from this accident. This concludes my presentation. Dr. Heff will now discuss safety systems.
Good morning. My presentation will focus on the planning and risk management of the EPIC dock project. EPIC had the pipelines near the project identified in a 2018 survey. To maintain awareness of the pipelines, EPIC requested that their location be included in the project drawings. Thus, employees from Orion Marine Group and Schneider Engineering and Consulting were informed of the hazardous pipelines in the area of the project. Nevertheless, as indicated by Mr. Ellers, the companies chose to use a dredging area that was too close to pipeline TX219 for safe cutterhead excavation. Enterprise was not included in the planning of the project. Had they been included, they may have discovered that the dredging area was too close to pipeline TX219 and suggested safer alternatives. For example, non-mechanized excavation methods, modification of the dredge plans to provide an increased standoff distance, or pipeline relocation. Mr. Stansel will discuss pipeline operations further in the next presentation. Orion's Health, Safety, and Environmental, or HSE, policies manual required the completion of a site-specific safety plan for the project. The regional HSE manager who developed it said it was an emergency response plan, which he completed by inputting applicable maps and phone numbers. He did not complete a risk assessment and was unaware of the pipelines near the dredge area. The site-specific safety plan did not address the pipelines in the area of the project, nor any site-specific risk. It did not help the captain's crew or levermen manage the risk associated with dredging near pipeline TX219. Orion's HSE manual required a job hazard analysis during the pre-planning stage of the project. However, there is no evidence that this was completed. Orion did not complete a formal risk assessment for the project. The hazard presented by conducting dredging operations near pipeline TX219 was never formally identified or documented, and the risk was not completely understood. As shown in this table, Orion employees had disparate understandings of the pipelines in the area, none of which were accurate. The actual distance between the dredge area and pipeline TX219 at the accident location was only about 1 foot. Effective controls protect workers from workplace hazards and help avoid injuries, illnesses, and incidents. Orion's HSE manual indicates that the hierarchy of controls should be used to mitigate hazards. It requires that when a hazard is identified, first attempt to eliminate the hazard. If elimination is not practicable, use engineering controls. If engineering controls are not practicable, implement administrative controls, and so on. Engineering controls were available to control the risk of a cutterhead impact with pipeline TX219. Orion could have established a tolerance zone around the pipelines in the engineering plans. This figure shows the location of the proposed bulkhead and fill, as well as pipeline TX219 and the accident location. Had Orion sequenced the completion of the bulkhead before dredging, the pipeline would have been covered with sand and protected from a cutterhead strike. Implementing this control would only have required coordination between Orion's dredging and construction departments. However, Orion did not implement these controls, nor any others, to prevent a cutterhead strike. Staff found that Orion's project planning and risk management were inadequate, which resulted in their failure to identify and mitigate the risk of a cutterhead impact with pipeline TX219. Staff believes it is critical that organizations have project planning steps that support accurate risk assessment and proportionate mitigation. Thus, staff proposes that for all future dredging projects, Orion conduct a formal documented risk assessment and develop a hazard control plan. This concludes my presentation. Mr. Stansel will now discuss pipeline operations.
Good morning, Chair Hamady, Vice Chairman Landsberg, and members Chapman and Graham. My presentation will cover pipeline damage prevention safety issues that were identified in this investigation. One-call systems allow excavators to make a single notification of their intent to excavate. One-call centers contact affected utility operators, who in turn are responsible for communicating with the excavator to review project plans and assess potential impacts to their facilities. Orion Marine Group completed a one-call notification almost 2 months before the accident. The Texas One Call Center identified 2 active pipelines near the project area, including pipeline TX219, which was damaged in this accident. Although the pipeline operator, Enterprise Products, directs its line locating personnel to schedule a meeting with excavators when a planned excavation area cannot be clearly determined. COVID-19 exposures resulted in an on-site plan review meeting being canceled. Instead, the Orion Marine Group project engineer emailed Enterprise incomplete and misleading dredging plans as described by Mr. Ehlers, which did not clearly indicate the full extent of the dredging area or the pipeline in all drawings. Staff found that the Orion project engineer misinterpreted the project drawings, overestimating the distance between the dredging area and pipeline TX-219. As a result, the project engineer communicated incorrect dredging boundaries to Enterprise, stating that dredging would be 60 feet off the shoreline and from where pipelines were located furthest in the water, and that dredging for nearshore dock platform areas had already been completed to grade. The project engineer added that there should not be a need for concern. This excerpt of the dredge plan provided to Enterprise technicians highlights the southern boundary of the shipping berth, which pipeline technicians understood from communications with the Orion project engineer to be the nearest extent of proposed dredging to the pipeline. At the accident location, the plan depicts this boundary about twice the 60-foot distance from the pipeline that was represented in Orion's one-call communications and does not include the dredging template's 2.5 to 1 slope between the berth boundary and shoreline. As a result of their assessment of plans and information provided by the project engineer, Enterprise technicians closed the one-call tickets, believing pipeline TX-219 would be clear of the project and there would be no dredging near the shoreline. Thus, technicians concluded that no marking or other protective measures would be required because the dredging boundary exceeded the Enterprise Damage Prevention Program 50-foot distance limit for mandatory marking. Investigators developed this image to depict information that was available to Orion during the planning phase of the dredging project. Investigators incorporated pre-accident pipeline survey data into DredgePack software and built a dredge template with 2.5 to 1 slopes identical to that which would have been loaded onto the Waymon Boyd's computer. The combination of this data shows the outside diameter of the pipeline was actually situated only about 1.2 feet from the edge of the dredge template at the accident location. Had this information been available to the pipeline technicians during their one-call review, they likely would have recognized the need for compulsory marking and the presence of a pipeline technician on site to monitor dredging work, among other actions to protect the pipeline. In summary, staff found that inaccurate communications following the one-call notification and misinterpreted dredge plans dissuaded Enterprise from installing compulsory pipeline markings and implementing other protective measures. Staff also found that marine construction projects require a greater level of collaboration and engineering review to ensure pipeline operators have greater awareness of the project scope and that potential safety impacts are accurately assessed. Therefore, staff proposes that Orion Marine Group develop written dredge planning policies to include utility operator engagement for pipeline avoidance measures. Further, staff proposes that the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the coastal and marine operators, and the Council for Dredging and Marine Construction Safety work together to develop processes for disseminating accurate pipeline location coordinates to dredge operators during planning and one-call locating activities. Next, I will discuss how the pipeline was marked prior to the accident and shortcomings and excavation pre-marking requirements. Given the Enterprise one-call review that determined dredging would occur outside of their 50-foot mandatory marking zone, pipeline technicians did not mark the pipeline for excavation damage avoidance. 2 weeks after the one-call tickets were closed, Orion followed up with an informal request to have the pipelines marked with cane poles for dredge anchor avoidance. Still led to believe dredging activities would be outside of its mandatory marking zone, Enterprise technicians used an optional marking technique known as courtesy marking, in which the pipeline was delineated with widely spaced cane poles. While a portion of on-land pipeline was marked with color-coded flags and paint, the cane poles were not color-coded or flagged. Such courtesy markings can raise awareness about utility conflicts that are more distant from excavation areas. However, they provide much less visibility than mandatory markings. Here are examples of the pipeline marking options provided in the Enterprise Damage Prevention Program. The left photograph shows pipeline technicians installing the widely spaced courtesy marking cane poles more than a month before the accident, which according to the program may be placed at intervals of up to 200 feet. The right photograph shows an example of mandatory markings at 20-foot intervals, which were used in connection with the post-accident pipeline evidence recovery and repair. If the pipeline had been marked with tightly spaced stakes or poles like those seen here, the marking would have provided a highly visible warning to the dredge crew. A supplemental practice that is used to inform pipeline operators of the exact location of a proposed excavation area is pre-marking, also known as white lining. Such pre-marking is done in advance of one-call notifications and is required by many state one-call regulations. NTSB recognized this practice in a 1997 safety study that concluded pre-marking an intended excavation site to indicate the area where underground facilities need to be identified is a practice that helps prevent excavation damage. Many state regulations, including Texas, require pre-marking when excavation boundaries cannot be clearly identified in a one-call notification, but do not specifically address marine construction activities. However, the project had not been pre-marked, leaving the pipeline technicians to rely solely on inaccurate information provided in the one-call communications. Although the near-shore boundary of the Epic Dock dredge template was in shallow water and could have been pre-marked with poles or stakes, techniques for pre-marking project boundaries in deeper water could include the use of buoys or accurate location data. Nevertheless, staff believes the presence of pre-marking showing the dredge project boundaries well within the Enterprise 50-foot marking zone would have changed the one-call assessment and prompted mandatory marking of the pipeline before dredging occurred. In summary, staff found that the widely spaced courtesy marking did not provide sufficient visual warning to the dredge crew of the danger posed by the presence of the pipeline. Additionally, to ensure more accurate communications, staff believes that that project boundary pre-marking would provide utility operators with visual confirmation of pipeline encroachment. Therefore, staff proposes safety recommendations to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the Coastal and Marine Operators, and the Council for Dredging and Marine Construction Safety to work together to develop guidance for pre-marking dredging project boundaries before one-call notifications are made. Finally, I will discuss the need for more expansive tolerance zones for the safety of dredging projects near pipelines. Tolerance zones define areas near pipelines where no mechanical excavation activity should occur and within which extra protections are needed for safe dredging. Texas and many other state regulations require excavation equipment to maintain a minimum buffer of at least 18 inches from a pipeline wall. In addition, enterprise procedures require technicians to be on scene to monitor activities when excavations occur within 12 feet of a pipeline. Staff agrees with pipeline and dredging industry safety organizations who advocate that the small distances called for in regulated tolerance zones are intended for land-based excavation and are too small for marine activities. Industry guidance suggests that damage avoidance procedures of pipeline and dredging companies vary considerably. Some pipeline companies may initially request as much as 500 feet of clearance from a pipeline, but may agree to closer distances with special conditions. Thus, staff believes that Enterprise's protective distance policies may not be sufficiently protective for dredging projects. The guidance also suggests that most dredging companies use 75 feet as a no-go working distance. However, Orion did not follow these industry best practices and did not have written policies addressing pipeline damage avoidance. In summary, staff found that inherent cutterhead dredging location inaccuracies make state-regulated tolerance zones inadequate for safe dredging. Additionally, staff found that Enterprise Damage Prevention Program does not provide for a sufficiently large tolerance zone for dredging operations. Therefore, staff proposes a safety recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to ensure that states incorporate minimum tolerance zone criteria for dredging in their pipeline safety programs. Staff also proposes a recommendation to Enterprise Products to revise its damage prevention program guidelines to include a larger tolerance zone appropriate for dredging operations. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Stansel. This concludes our presentations. Chair Halmody, we're happy to answer your questions at this time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Wisniewski, Mr. Ehlers, Dr. Hoff, and Mr. Stansel for your excellent presentations, and thank you for all the work on this, all your work on this investigation. We'll now turn to board member questions focused on the key safety issues in this accident. First, operations. Then we'll ask questions on project planning and risk assessment. And then we'll ask questions on pipeline damage prevention. And then finally, any other safety issues board members would like to raise. Some members may have comments on every safety issue, some may not. The purpose of this discussion and focused deliberation is to highlight those areas where we believe we can make the most impact on improving safety. Vice Chairman Landsberg, would you like to begin the discussion on operations?
Thank you very much, Chair, and to staff, an excellent and comprehensive presentation. In my short time on the board, we have investigated quite a number of these kinds of tragedies, and this has been going on for decades now, that when you dig a hole, you probably need to be well aware of the fact that there could be some hazards underneath. This is going to seem rhetorical, but I want to make sure that it gets into the record. Was Orion aware at all that there was a pipeline in vicinity? Mr. Ehlers, I guess that might go to you.
Yes, Vice Chairman. Yes, absolutely. They were aware. Number one, they had information provided by EPIC through the utility survey that had been done in 2018, which provided location data, and they also were made aware of it during the one call process. So they were absolutely aware of it. It was discussed at some of their pre-project meetings, but it was determined by the company to be outside the template, and so therefore it was pretty much dismissed as a danger when the actual dredging began.
So just to clarify this, on slide 22 and 23, slide 23 being the dredge limit coordinates, perhaps we could bring those up. it appears that there was no dredging plan outside of the highlighted yellow limits that we see on this slide, and on the slide 23, it's marked A, B, C, and D. And yet, the blue lines on the previous slide clearly indicate that there were pipelines. Could you explain this a little bit more? I mean, I'm confused about why the company, if they knew it was there, didn't explain that to their operations team.
The problem that we believe starts right here with the drawing, that there was no drawing that showed both the pipelines and the full extent of the dredging, which included the slope. And so the project engineer, who was responsible for communicating the danger both to the utility company enterprise and also internally to the dredge, made an inaccurate estimate of the distance between the pipelines and the dredging area. So almost every Orion person we talked to said they believed it wasn't a danger because it was, again, outside the template.
Okay, well, that was a critical omission. It was noted in the report that Orion had scheduled safety briefings prior to the beginning of each work shift. Did those briefings include any sort of checklist or format to cover mandatory or critical items such as pipelines?
No, we did not see any checklist associated with the daily safety briefs. They did a safety topic and then covered things like PPE, and there was absolutely no indication of dangers such as pipelines.
That doesn't seem like a very effective checklist. Was the placement of the cane poles provided by the enterprise technicians accurate? Mr. Stansel, that probably goes to you.
Yes, they would have been accurate. The technicians used line locating equipment, which included a transmitter that was attached to a nearby cathodic protection station. And then they used a handheld receiver that provided them the pipeline location. Based on that, they installed the cane poles about 5 feet channelward of where the pipe was located.
So what effect would their placement have had on the dredging operation in terms of how close the leverman would have allowed the dredge to come?
Well, we have to remember that the cane poles were not installed for excavation damage protection. They were installed for anchor avoidance. So they weren't intended to be a visual warning for excavation damage to the pipeline.
I should also add that the cane poles did not begin right at the shoreline, essentially the area closest to where the accident happened. The technicians noted that the soil was too thick or too difficult to put the cane poles in, so they started 40 or 50 feet east of where, again, the pipeline came out of the shore. So the leverman described no cane poles in the area where he was dredging.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair Hominy. Which plans did the survey superintendent use to create the dredge pack template?
He used the Schneider Engineering and Consulting plans.
Okay, that would be the dredge site plan, correct?
Yes, so he used the coordinates from the dredge site plan to map out the berth coordinates, and then used the system's automated slope generator to generate the slope portion of the dredge template and dredge pack.
Okay, great. That's what I want to talk about. If you could pull up slide 23 again, that would be great. And as we know on that slide, the dredge site plan listed 4 coordinates, A, B, C, and D, shown in the bottom right there. Those were the coordinates for the berth only. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so did the dredge site plan list any coordinates for the slope?
No, it didn't.
It did not. So how did the survey superintendent generate the slope in the dredge pack?
Dredge pack has an automated generator for a slope. So the person developing the plan puts the coordinates of the berth for this example in, and then tells the system, that is Dredge pack, that they want a 2.5 to 1 slope, and then Dredge pack automatically develops that and then comes up with the coordinates for the extent of the slope.
Okay, so once the slope was automatically generated, how close was the dredge pack plan to the pipeline at its nearest point?
At its nearest point, it was less than a foot.
Less than a foot. Okay, Orion had the 2018 TMI solution survey data that showed the location of the pipeline. Did Orion input the pipeline location into the dredge pack?
No.
They did not. So what is the process? And please include the time and the resources to program the pipeline location into the dredge pack.
It's a very simple process because the dredge pack information had been provided in an AutoCAD format, which can be imported into dredge pack. We did this, the NTSB staff did this with the assistance of a HYPAC representative, and I think it took less than a minute.
Less than a minute. Can you pull up slide 28, please? I know it takes a minute there. Yeah, we look at the cutter head there. That's a large, heavy, imperfect piece of machinery, as you said in the presentation. The pipeline was within 1 foot of the planned dredging, and Orion failed to input the pipeline data into dredge pack, which could have shown the Waymon Boyd crew the location of the pipeline before it was struck. What a tragedy. I don't understand why that wasn't done. Chair, I'll go ahead and yield back the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Graham. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. The presentation was really excellent. I'm not familiar with this sort of operation, so I'm learning as we go along here. Really appreciated the outstanding presentation, and I'll be asking some questions, I'm sure, which will require you to repeat some of what was already presented, and I hope you'll bear with me. I have a few questions regarding, I believe it's called the SCADA system or the SCADA system. How is that acronym pronounced?
SCADA.
SCADA.
Yes.
I understand that SCADA is an acronym for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. Will you please describe what the SCADA system is designed to do?
In this particular case, the SCADA system monitors the flows and pressures on the pipeline at various locations, and also reports. It'll report unusual operating conditions via error messages or alerts to the pipeline controller at the controller's headquarters in Houston. I'm sorry.
Did the SCADA system function as intended in this case?
Yes, it did.
So it generated a number of alerts.
It generated an alert, a low pressure alarm within seconds of the pipeline breach. It was identified to the pipeline controller, acknowledged the alert. The initial indication was a 44 PSI drop from where it had been running.
And did the controller and pipeline technicians, did they respond appropriately to the alerts generated by the SCADA system?
Yes, sir, they did. So the pipeline controller observed the first alert, followed shortly thereafter by a second alert. This prompted the automatic closing valve to actuate and start shutting down the pipeline. The pipeline was shut down within 3 minutes. So the pipeline controller dispatched local personnel to confirm the pressure readings. Once the pressure readings were confirmed, he actuated some redundant remote closing valves to further isolate the pipeline. And that was less than half an hour after the incident, although the pipeline flow had already stopped by then.
So as devastating as this tragedy was, had the SCADA system failed to function as intended, or had the response been less timely, is it conceivable the loss of life and resulting damage could have been even worse?
No, sir, I don't think that given the circumstances here, there would have been any difference, because line drain down would still have occurred over a period of hours. So all of the line pack within the pipeline drained out through the breach in the line. So once it coincidentally at the time of the incident, the batch delivery of propane into the pipeline system had stopped. So there was no additional flow entering the pipeline system. The automatic valve would have shut regardless, because it's programmed to react to pressure and flow set points. And that, like I said, would have occurred regardless of any actions taken by the pipeline controller. The pipeline controller simply added redundancy to the isolation.
I see, that's helpful. And just to clarify, the function of this particular pipeline was to transmit batches on an intermittent basis. This was not a constant flow running through this pipeline. It was coming in batches from time to time, correct?
You are correct, yes.
I have some additional questions in this area, Chair. I'll hold those for my next round.
Thank you, Member Chapman. A couple of questions. Can you pull up the chart on, I think it's slide 38. And while you're pulling that up, just a few questions, Mr. Ellers. If you do pipeline construction, should you know where coordinates are and provide training to your personnel?
You say pipeline construction?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you do pipeline installation and repair, should you provide training to your personnel?
Absolutely.
How about relocation and abandonment?
Yes.
Okay. The reason I ask that question is that on Orion Marine Group's webpage, they state, the Orion Marine Group has extensive experience in a wide range of marine pipeline construction projects, including shallow water, lay barge installation, repair, abandonment, and trenching. And go on to say Orion has amassed an outstanding record of safely completing these projects to our client's satisfaction. I would think a company that advertises it does all these things would actually train their personnel to know how to work safely around pipelines. These are not me working in my backyard, calling 811, which I do, with hand tools. This is, as Member Graham pointed out, a very large operation where the leverman is working from software with very heavy equipment underwater. So that underscores the need for training. But before I come back to training for a second, I want to focus on this chart here, because I think it really describes every other problem that occurred with respect to this pipeline. How is it that, and you said that Orion knew there was a pipeline and had survey information conducted by TMI, which was commissioned by EPIC in 2018, or completed in 2018. So they had very detailed information about this pipeline, knew of its existence from the very beginning. Is that correct? And pre-planning?
That's correct.
So how do we get to the point where the design engineer says, you know what, it's 8 to 10 feet. The health, safety, and environmental manager says he or she is not aware of the pipeline. The project manager says it's 30 feet. It's put on the ticket, the one-call ticket, for 55 feet. The Orion project engineer says it's 60 feet, and everybody else, other people aren't even aware of the pipeline. How do we get to that? How does that occur?
That is something that we tried to figure out. And I think what we came down to is the lack of training. And you touched on this in your initial question and comments. The lack of training throughout the Orion Group staff about pipeline awareness training. And then also, I do believe, although they are aware of and understood the hazard of a pipeline, that once the determination was made that it was outside the template, I think the concern was lost or there was
dismissed.
Dismissed. That's probably a good term for it.
Yeah, so every other decision then that was made, including the place, well, we'll get to damage prevention later, but every other decision that was made was based on a misinterpretation or misunderstanding of where the pipeline was in location to dredging operations, correct?
Yes, that's what we believe.
Okay. And so TMI, they did this survey that EPIC commissioned in 2018. Following the pipeline strike, Enterprise conducted its own survey. What did that survey find, and how close was it to the findings to TMI in 2018 in terms of the location of the pipeline and to dredging operations?
I can answer that question, Chair Hominy. That pipeline survey that Enterprise commissioned through its contractor using a high resolution within 0.1 feet plus or minus showed that the TMI survey was within inches of the actual pipe location.
So the information that Orion had was accurate from the very beginning.
It was.
And so when they say we didn't have GPS coordinates, they really didn't need GPS coordinates because they had information. And in fact, whose responsibility was it to ask for GPS coordinates?
It was
if they wanted. It was the excavator, correct. Okay, I have more questions, so we'll go to a second round of questions. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Chair Homendy. Texas State Regulation Rule 18.4 states that an excavator shall make a check for any unmarked pipelines. Was that accomplished?
In this case, we can only believe that it was not because there was no follow-up one-call notice made to the notification center to refresh the pipeline markings. The regulations require that the excavator check for the presence of unmarked pipelines, or if the markers are missing or damaged, they should have filed a second one-call notice to have the marks repaired or refreshed.
Well, it seems like we've pretty thoroughly established that they should have known that the pipeline was there. So this may be under project planning, or maybe it falls under operations. Mr. Allers, there appears to be some inadequate training here. That's probably an obvious statement. And how is it that the project engineer can be working in this profession and yet by their admission said they had no training on pipeline safety as stated in the report? And this is a university graduate in engineering, I would assume, and has been on the job. How can that be?
Well, I'll start with the educational background. So dredging industry is a pretty niche industry, so there's no degree in dredging. The project engineer had a degree in offshore and coastal engineering. She stated that her school offered a 1-semester course in dredging, but that she hadn't taken that course. But really, in the case like this, it's really incumbent on the company then to fill in the gaps that a university education, a general university education, wouldn't provide. And Orion did not fill in those gaps as far as pipeline avoidance training.
Well, it would seem to me that if you're offering a degree in engineering on these kinds of things, that it would certainly be a good idea to have a safety course, at least 1 semester, that would be covering these items. And I would certainly hope that this tragedy becomes a case study for all involved, and particularly for the universities as well as the companies, that they do provide adequate training in this area, because even though a company may have a perfect record, that just means they were lucky, not necessarily that they were good. Chair, I have no further questions in this topic area, so I yield back the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Landsberg. Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair Hamady. If you could pull up slide 38 again, please. I'll go into a little more of this, what the chair was talking about. You know, this is unfortunately, another example of a tragedy of the what I like to call the Swiss cheese model of accident causation. You know, various people could have stopped this in its tracks along the way and didn't. People had information, but nobody put it all together, and nobody stood up and said, hey, we're getting awful close to this pipeline, unfortunately. So I want to talk about the Snyder design engineer. Did this engineer have access to the 2018 TMI solution survey that showed where the pipeline or the pipelines were located?
Yes, this was the data that he imported into the plans that you see on the first drawing in the Snyder plans.
When the design engineer measured the distance based on the drawings and determined the pipeline was 8 to 10 feet away at its closest point, was that accurate?
No, it wasn't.
Was there anybody there that verified the work of this engineer and drawings?
Yes. So once the drawings had been completed, it was reviewed by one of the principal engineers at the design firm.
At the design firm. Okay. And I guess they came up with the same results?
Yes, they did discuss the 8 to 10 feet, but there was no question of that distance that we know of.
Okay. The Orion survey superintendent, this individual was responsible for programming the dredge pack. How did the survey superintendent consider the risk of the pipeline when programming the dredge pack?
He really didn't. He was aware of it. He said that, he had awareness that these pipelines were, I think his words were something to the effect of up on the shoreline. But he's reliant on being provided data or information about these hazards. And since he wasn't provided location data, he didn't put it into dredge pack. And so his assumption was, again, it was outside the template, so not a concern.
Yeah, and I think pulling from one of his interview quotes, he said pipelines were not considered at all when he put it in. The Orion project engineer, did they have access to the dredging plans?
Yes, in fact, that's what she used to, if you're talking about the Snyder dredging plans, yes, that's what she used to estimate the distance, and they were the plans that she sent to Enterprise as part of the one call process.
And understanding the plans were confusing and deficient, did she accurately determine the distance between the planned dredging and the pipelines?
No.
No, 60 feet, actually. And I think she determined it was far enough away. I think it was a quote in the interview.
Yes.
Okay, and you already answered my next question about that in the email she passed on to Enterprise, so it was 60 feet away. So I can see the non-concern by Enterprise. And finally, the Orion project engineer, or a project manager, excuse me. The project engineer had only 11 months of experience, so the project manager was her supervisor. Did the project manager review the dredging plans?
He stated that he was familiar with them, yes.
Yeah. Did he raise any concern about damage to the pipeline?
Not from the cutter head. There was concern raised about the anchors that the dredge uses to position the vessel, but that was again after the one call process that Mr. Stansel described, and it was not related to the dredging itself. It was the placement of these anchors.
Correct. He was still concerned about that. I mean, to the point also that he went as far to call Enterprise to courtesy mark the pipelines, correct?
Yeah, he asked the project engineer to do that, correct?
Yeah, and still nobody here had any idea that the slope was within 1 foot of the pipeline. That's all the questions I have on this subject, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member Graham. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. It seems clear to me that there was more than sufficient information available to conclude that dredging operations would be dangerously close to this pipeline. Having said that, I recall from the presentation that there are at least 3 sources of location accuracy limitations that could have contributed to placing the cutter head dangerously close to the pipeline. Briefly, would you please elaborate on those limitations on location accuracy and explain how they impact the margin of safety?
Sure. The first is GPS accuracy. So the system on board the Waymon Boyd, the GPS system that fed information into Dredge Pack in their spec sheets had an accuracy of 1 meter, 3.3 feet. So that alone would have put the cutter head within striking distance, as we said in the presentation. The antenna for the GPS, where the GPS signal comes in, was on top of the leverman room, which is like on a vessel, like a ship is like your bridge. That was 118 feet or so from the cutter head itself, and that information has to be measured and put into Dredge Pack so that Dredge Pack can do the calculation of where that cutter head is. Also, because the cutter head pivots down, it uses an automated input from an inclinometer, obviously because the distance as it pivots down, that distance also changes. So those are all those inputs. If they are not accurate, can, even by a little bit, can offset where that cutter head virtually is to where it really is. And then the last thing is the display of Dredge Pack. So it's a computer screen, probably much like the one you're looking at, of which is broken up into various views. So the smaller your image, the feet become mere pixels as far as distance is concerned. And then the cutter head display on Dredge Pack it's an X. And the leverman described to us that he put the X, as he was dredging a slope, he put that X, the center of that X, on the slope. So where, this cutter head is about 6.5 feet across by 3 feet deep around, where that X center is, we don't know because the information was lost when during the explosion. But again, if that center of that X wasn't exactly where that tooth was operating in vicinity of that pipeline, again, these are all errors when compounded, make for errors in accuracy that have to be accounted for in things like tolerant zones around a vessel, around a hazard like a pipeline.
Could there also have been a margin of error associated with the location data for the pipeline that was included in the utility survey that was developed before the dredging operations began?
I'll answer that, and Paul, you can jump in if you want. Yes, absolutely. We had access to various sources of location data for that pipeline, some of it pretty latent, some of it very updated. As we mentioned, the 2018 survey was very close to the very accurate data we got after the accident, but other data put that pipeline up to a couple feet away. Various reasons for that. Some surveys don't need that accuracy. The pipeline can move, that kind of thing. So certainly accounting for the accuracy of the location of the pipeline is necessary.
So the point here, and certainly I gather you'll agree, is that even with the best equipment and the best training, there are intrinsic data limitations, and that makes it very important to budget those limitations into an appropriate margin of safety.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. No more questions in this area for me.
Thank you. Mr. Ellers, can you pull up slide 38 again? I just had one last question on that. On slide 38, the last line, it says Enterprise One called technicians. The understanding of the distance was 55 feet. How did they get 55 feet? Where did they get that?
Paul?
Yeah, so what we believe occurred there was that the hazardous liquid pipeline, TX219, was further channelward from the gas pipeline to pipeline 124. And so I think they ran parallel to each other. They're a little bit more than 5 feet apart, but I think he indicated that on the one call ticket to account for the fact that that pipeline was further channelward from the other pipeline and then from the shore as well.
Okay, great. I just wanted to ask that one question. You can take down that slide. Following the pipeline strike, Orion instituted underwater utilities awareness training for all dredge crews and shoreside support staff. An overview of the training tool is at the end of Orion's party submission. I'm just pulling it up. I looked at the description of the training, and then I looked at training in CAMO, and it seems to not address all the issues that training should address, although granted, I haven't watched whatever training video there is with this. But what should training look like?
Well, I think, again, I'll let Paul join in here. I think number one is a great start is that CAMO online training that's provided. And then from there, which provides everything from the pre-planning up until day-to-day operations. I think from there, training needs to include site-specific awareness. So, for instance, Orion told us that not only do they do semi-annual training, but they also do the training if a project includes a pipeline. We would hope that training includes making the crew of the dredge and those involved aware of those site-specific hazards that are there.
Yeah, so I'll add to that. So I actually took the CAMO training and found that it follows the published guidance that they put out fairly closely. It covers a couple of the high points, I think, is that it covers how working near underwater pipelines differs from land-based excavation. It goes through making the one-call notifications. It talks about project research and planning steps for pipeline and marine construction personnel. And it sort of highlights why communication is key to project design and implementation in pipeline avoidance. And it also goes through the emergency and safety checklists and so forth. So I found it to be fairly comprehensive.
I want to switch gears a little bit and focus on what went right here. And I think this is what Member Chapman was getting at, specifically the actions of the Enterprise Pipeline Controller and the use of automatic control valves. We've seen in a great many, too many, pipeline accidents in which SCADA personnel doubted or ignored the validity of low pressure alarms. They received in 2010, and bridge controllers in Edmonton ignored alarms for 17 hours while a pipeline in Marshall, Michigan pumped nearly 1 million gallons of crude oil into the Kalamazoo River, a pipeline rupture that I had investigated in my previous position before I came to the board. And likewise, we've investigated too many pipeline accidents in which the absence of automatic or remote controlled valves led to fatalities, injuries, and significant property damage. And the one I'm thinking about here, of course, is the 2010 gas pipeline explosion in San Bruno, California, where we found that it took PG&E personnel 95 minutes to isolate the flow of gas to the rupture site. So, Mr. Stansel, in this accident, can you tell me specifically how long it took the enterprise controller in Houston to respond to the first low pressure alarm on the SCADA system?
So he acknowledged the initial pressure reduction within seconds, and then seconds after that, there was a second one. The control valve, or the automatic shutdown valve, sort of took the decision point away from him and automatically started closing and started closing at about 3 minutes and was completed by 5 or 7 minutes afterwards. So that at that point, he took all of the necessary steps to verify that there was a issue with the pipeline. He sent local assets to the scene to verify the pressure reading that he was seeing on the SCADA system. Once that was confirmed, then he added some redundant remote shutdown valves to further isolate the line. Even if this pressure reduction had been allowed to continue, I'm sure, well, I would assume that he could have used the remote, if he didn't have the automatic shutdown valve operating on its own, he could have used the remote valves to isolate the line. But in this case, it wasn't necessary.
Right. And so within 2 to 3 minutes after the initial low pressure alarm, that automatic control valve had prevented introduction of any more liquid propane into the pipeline from the refinery. And we know 2 to 3 minutes to isolate a damaged pipeline is far better than 95 minutes or certainly 17 hours. So, Mr. Rainey, has the board made recommendations, and this is a little off topic, but I will take the opportunity to bring it up as always, because it is an important issue when we're talking about pipelines. Has the board made recommendations before on the issuance or the issue of automatic or remote controlled valves on pipelines?
Chair Hominy, yes, we have. In fact, we have 2 recommendations currently on our current most wanted list of transportation improvements, P1110 and P1111, both coming out of the San Bruno accident, issued to PHMSA to require the operators of natural gas transmission and distribution pipelines to equip their SCADA systems with tools in recognizing and pinpointing the location of leaks, line breaks, can provide real-time leak detection and appropriately spaced flow and pressure transmitters. The second recommendation on the most wanted list is P1111, and to require automatic shutoff valves and remote control valves in high consequence areas. And so, yes, the answer is we do have recs on that area.
And just staying on here, what actions has PHMSA, and this is my last question, what actions has PHMSA taken in response to our recommendations?
Let me pull that up. Currently, our status on those, we have acceptable responses, and those are both still open and pending.
And there is a 2020 notice of proposed rulemaking, which does need some work. If I recall, it only applies to new pipelines and not to older pipelines. And we've mentioned a few other things that we hope that PHMSA can tighten up. some safety gaps. But again, this was a good news story by Enterprise's pipeline controllers and personnel for taking action immediately, which is always good to recognize. So with that, and I just want to give my colleagues a chance to ask any more questions in this area before I move on to the next area. Okay, so the board will now discuss project planning and risk assessment. Vice Chairman Landsberg, you're recognized for your time.
Thank you, Chair Homendy. I have just a couple of questions here. I think it's pretty obvious that the planning here left a lot to be desired, and that's being charitable. This is probably for Dr. Hopf, but I'm not sure. Could you explain the difference between courtesy marking and normal marking?
Yes, I can speak briefly to that issue, and then Mr. Stansel can further answer any questions. But a key difference is the spacing between the poles.
Okay.
I can add to that if you wish. So the difference between courtesy markings is the spacing. Courtesy markings are an optional marking technique that can be done to enhance awareness of pipelines that are more distant from a project. They're not required, but when requested, it's up to the pipeline technician's discretion. The markings can be placed at intervals of up to 200 feet apart, whereas the mandatory markings must be placed at 20-foot intervals.
That's quite a difference. And didn't you say there was something about that the technicians had difficulty in placing the poles in certain areas? Did I hear that correctly?
So the technicians, the bottom was too hard in the area near the accident location. So the first cane pole was installed some distance further, but it was still within the 200-foot distance required by the courtesy marking.
So is it fair to say, does this provide appropriate guidance to excavation crews, or is it just not one of those things that we do it strictly because we can, not because it's required, and your mileage may vary?
So this is something that's not universally used amongst all pipeline operators. The Enterprise would have been correct not to put any marking there at all, given the information that they were provided. So it is important to note that those courtesy markings were not intended for excavation damage prevention, only for anchor avoidance. So they were not intended to help the levermen avoid hitting the pipeline.
Okay. We talked around this a little bit earlier, but who in all of the parties responsible had any formal training in working around pipelines and the hazards therein? I realize that this is very much an OJT kind of situation, but we seem to keep finding, all roads point to, well, somebody didn't know. And so is there any formal kind of training required to operate in this environment?
No, there's not. And no one in Orion had any kind of formal pipeline avoidance training.
So Camo and some of the other groups involved, these are merely good ideas, as opposed to saying, if you're going to be a member and use our logo and so forth, we really insist that you complete these courses.
It is voluntary. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions in this area, Chair Homendy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Landsberg. Now, Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair Homendy. If you could pull up slide 40 for me, I have questions about the proposed bulkhead in this case. First First of all, who proposed the bulkhead and what was it intended for?
The bulkhead was part of the plan for the dock. Its intention, I believe, according to the design engineer, was to provide a parking and laydown area for the dock, for vehicles and such using the dock.
Okay, and who would have constructed this?
It was going to be constructed by Orion Marine Group, their construction side of their operation, which is separate from their dredging side.
Okay. Could the proposed bulkhead have been loaded into the Dredge Pack software template?
There's no reason it couldn't have been.
There's no reason it couldn't, but it wasn't.
It was not, no.
So that, looking at that diagram there, that area would have been I would assume maybe a concrete bulkhead and then fill in behind it then?
Yes, I don't remember what the construction was supposed to be, whether it was pilings or concrete, but it was going to be backfilled with, I believe, sand was the base material.
So there wouldn't have been any reason to dredge that slope all the way up to the pipeline if this bulkhead was going to be put in.
If it had been constructed prior to dredging, that's correct. Because it wasn't constructed prior to dredging, they had to dredge a slope in order to maintain the berth depth that was planned.
Okay. Well, it's kind of interesting. Yeah. Do we know why that wasn't put in first?
I don't think there didn't seem to be any sequencing plan between the dredging operation and the construction plan. The construction plan had a fairly detailed sequencing plan that we saw, but it didn't include the dredging. So they seem to be operating independently and not coordinated. We do know that at one point there was a plan to build the bulkhead before in mid-July. This would have been before the accident, but for whatever reason, it was not constructed and was not in place when the accident happened in August.
Okay. So was there any risk assessment team put together for this project at all to determine, what should go in first and how the slope would be done and locations of pipeline? Was there a dedicated risk assessment team?
No, so there's not.
There wasn't one, which leads me to my next comment. Looking at the Orion party submission, I am just amazed. There's a section out of there, section 4. It says failures of enterprise. They want to put blame on enterprise for a lot of different things. And one of them was for not putting a diverse risk assessment team together that would have flagged the epic dock project involving dredging near shore, calling for a bulkhead and fill. I'm quoting from their submittal. An experienced risk assessment team would have made sure the bulkhead and fill were accomplished prior to dredging or ensured that a company representative was present on the dredge. So Orion didn't have a risk assessment team, is that correct?
That is correct.
And in this case of this project, if there was a risk assessment team, who should have put that team together?
That likely would have been the regional HSC manager assigned to the project.
The HSC manager for Orion, correct?
For Orion, yes.
So I think it's very interesting that they put the onus on enterprise to put this together and have either put the bulkhead in first or made sure one of their representatives was on the team, but yet they were never invited to a team that didn't exist. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you for that. And that's all the questions. Well, I have more questions on this, but I'll yield back the rest of my time. Thank you.
Member Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. I actually want to pick up a little bit on a similar theme to Member Graham's questions. I want to focus on site-specific safety plans, or SSSPs. And the draft report states that the Regional Health, Safety, and Environmental Manager, that's Orion's manager, considered that the SSSP was essentially an emergency response plan. I gather that, if done appropriately, an SSSP is more than an emergency response plan. Will you please discuss the elements which should be included in a well-constructed site-specific safety plan for a significant dredging project such as this one?
Absolutely. The most critical piece of a site-specific safety plan is a discussion of site-specific risk. Primarily, that would include hazard identification as well as a hazard control plan.
And the proximity of the pipeline was not identified as a hazard in this case, of course, correct?
That is correct.
So in addition to including the proximity of pipelines, which seems obvious to me, what other categories of site-specific hazards might a well-constructed SSSP consider?
It really just depends on the nature of the job. The site-specific safety plan that was developed for the Epic Dock project had a lot of generalized safety material discussing storms, fires, PPE. All of those sorts of things are good. However, the discussion that was contained was just generalized. For example, there was a section on helicopter safety, which was not necessarily, that space would have been better suited to discuss the specific features of this project. What PPE would be needed for this project? What would be the anticipated weather for the season that this would be completed? What would be the boats that would be used? The safety of those boats, the qualifications of the crew that they would need. But again, it's the difference between a generalized safety policy and the site-specific safety plan is it's supposed to be site-specific. In this site-specific safety plan, the only thing that was site-specific was the address and the phone numbers.
And if you're going to err on the side of caution. So if there's a question as to whether or not to include a hazard such as a pipeline in the site-specific safety plan, you're better off including it than not including it, right?
Yes, sir.
Is the use of a risk matrix appropriate? And if so, what does a risk matrix involve?
A risk matrix is a widely used tool when performing a risk assessment. Basically, it provides a visual reference which aids management in their decision-making process. It shows, it allows project planners to make an assessment of the likelihood of a risk resulting in some sort of accident. It also looks at the severity of that. So, for example, in the case of pipeline TX219, the cutterhead impact would, of course, be catastrophic because of the possibility of multiple fatalities. And, of course, the likelihood would have been very high as well, given the proximity of the dredge template and the pipeline.
So it's not an infallible tool, but it certainly is a useful device for helping identify and analyze potential risks, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair Hamady. No further questions from me in this area.
Thank you very much, Member Chapman. Was the presence of the pipelines ever discussed in pre-planning design phase?
Yes, it was.
Among Schneider, Epic, and Orion representatives, right?
That is correct.
Was Enterprise present for the meetings?
Enterprise was not present for those meetings.
Were they invited to the meetings?
They were not.
They were not. Okay, so Enterprise wasn't at any of the planning meetings because they weren't invited to the meetings. And the site-specific safety plan, really, you just said the only thing that was really site-specific was the address and phone number, correct?
That's correct.
So it's difficult for me to fathom that any company performing dredging services anywhere in the Gulf of Mexico would not expressly build into a site-specific work safety plan or any other safety meetings or planning meetings the potential presence of a hazardous liquid pipeline near their dredging operations. It's even more difficult for me to understand it when Orion Marine Group actively, again, promotes themselves as having extensive experience in pipeline construction, installation, repair, relocation, and abandonment. So we've talked about the Orion project engineer stating that she had personally received no training on pipeline safety and wasn't aware that it was even offered to employees. In staff's interview with the project manager for Orion for the Epic dock dredging, the manager was asked whether the company had ever issued any reports under its Target Zero safety program relating to working near pipelines. He said no. So what does all this tell you about the organizational culture at Orion and the safety culture at Orion?
You bring up a good point in terms of culture. So Orion's safety programs policies actually requires that utility locate information be included in their site-specific safety plans, and it wasn't. And what we observed here was frankly, a systematic non-adherence to their own safety policies. And really the only way you can explain that is safety culture. It's talking to the HSC director, basically he put all the onus for safety risk management on the crew and the captain. And that deferral of management responsibilities for safety management can only be defined by poor safety culture.
Well, and safety management occurs well before you get to on site with the crew and the captain and others. In fact, I was kind of surprised by the quote in our report from the company's health, safety, and environmental program director, which described his perspective on risk management as follows. Risk management is done as the project goes forward. When we're actually on site, you can't mitigate for hazards until you're actually on the project identifying what the hazards are. You can, put a plan together in the office, but construction and dredging are in the field, and that's where we actually need to be boots on the ground before we can identify what the hazards are that we need to keep our crews safe from. Is that how you do risk management?
No.
Oh. I mean, what I don't understand is we have a situation. I mean, there's site-specific hazards were not addressed. Enterprise wasn't part of any of the meetings. There were no safety meetings where the pipelines came up. In fact, that morning were the pipelines mentioned in the safety briefing?
No, they were not.
No, they were not. How can you have your crew on site and not mention or not bring up the biggest hazard there, or one of the biggest hazards there? And then the job hazard analysis, nothing on the pipelines in there, right?
Yeah, so there's two types of job hazard analysis. There's the pre-planning, which wasn't completed at all, and there was the JHA was on the dredge. And if that did exist, it unfortunately burned up in the fire. So it's not clear what happened, but we do know that the captain was not able to attend the job hazard analysis that was completed, if one was completed on the morning of the accident. So indeed, the way that the information should flow is there should be a during the planning phase of the project, they should identify those hazards, identify a hazard control plan, and then that should be communicated to the captains and the crew. And then the morning safety briefing would be when the captain would then brief the crew. However, the captain was never provided a safety briefing on pipeline TX 219.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, if I could just jump in here. And yes, as Mr. Ellers and Dr. Heff has pointed out in their presentations, staff has proposed recs in these areas for risk assessment, a formal risk assessment, as well as operating procedures for the dredge.
Yeah, thank you very much. Second round of questions in this area. Vice Chairman Landsberg?
No further questions, Chair.
Great. Member Graham?
No further questions. You covered what I was going to ask just a minute ago. Thank you.
Okay. Member Chapman?
No further questions, Chair.
Okay. Then with that, just make sure I covered my, okay. We're going to now discuss pipeline damage prevention. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Stansel, could you describe tolerance area?
Yeah, so a tolerance zone in terms of the regulatory environment is an area within which no mechanical excavation should take place and within which extra protections are necessary, such as having observers on site or using non-mechanical methods to conduct excavation.
So this appears, I think, to be mentioned in Rule 18.9 of the Texas Administrative Code, and they show 18 inches plus half the pipe diameter, which I think probably works okay on land, but that's way too close, is it not, for working in the marine environment?
Yes, that's what we believe, and the organizations such as CAMO and CDMCS also believe that as well, and we agree.
What would they recommend in terms of how close you should get? And kind of a part and parcel of all of this is, what's the difference in tolerance based on the type of digging equipment? I think we've seen that the cutter head dredge is not exactly the most precise piece of equipment. So how would that work?
There are no published criteria for tolerance zones in the CAMO guidance, and I think CDMCS also mentions this. Dredging companies use a no-go working distance of 75 feet, and that was a poll of their membership to come up with an average no-go working distance. So we don't know if that is standard throughout the entire industry or just within a number of members of those organizations. And the same with pipelines. They mentioned that some pipeline companies request as much as 500 feet and then would agree to much less distance depending on the circumstances or having an excavation protocol agreement in place.
So even by relatively non-conservative standards, i.e. 75 feet, we were way, way closer than we should have been in this particular case. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely.
I think this has been covered before, but the cutter head dredge is not that accurate. And in terms of tolerances, how close could you get reasonably with a cutter head dredge and have an allowable margin of error?
I don't know that we can answer that question. With respect to the current guidance that Enterprise Products uses in its damage prevention program, in which they require anything going on within 12 feet of their pipeline to be monitored by their personnel. We don't believe that is adequate enough. PHMSA and the organizations to whom we've directed this recommendation to develop tolerance zone guidance need to work on that and determine what is appropriate for various circumstances.
So as we get into the planning, and I think you may have touched on this earlier, but how accurate is pipeline marking equipment?
Yeah, so the marking equipment used by the Enterprise, the pipeline locating equipment used by the Enterprise technicians has an accuracy of location accuracy and depth accuracy of plus or minus 5%. So what the instrument does, you have a transmitter that you connect to a cathodic protection station, which imparts a radio signal to the pipeline. And then you have a handheld receiver that they use to pinpoint the location. All of this, that is accurate enough for placing markings in their process. They use 5 feet of additional distance channelward as where to mark the pipeline. But the tolerance zones for dredging need to account for all of these things. If you're going to mark a pipeline that's deep underwater, that imparts some additional issues. divers may need to be sent down with underwater antenna to locate pipelines. So there's some difficulties, especially in the marine environment, which call for the need for larger tolerance zones.
Thank you very much. Chair, I'll defer the rest of my questions. Thank you.
Sure. Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair Hamady. Question about the one call. Did one call ever receive an accurate and exact location, as in a diagram or anything like that, or coordinates from the Orion project engineer on the location of the dredge template?
The coordinates, there were coordinates provided to the one call center. The coordinates encompassed not only the dredging area, but a considerable distance beyond it. So it did not provide the dredge box, for instance, or the slope. It was just we are working in this general area.
As a matter of fact, I think on one of your slides, they thought the closest encroachment area was about 55 feet away, I believe, 55, 60 feet away.
Yes, sir. The toe of the slope and that dredge prism that's displayed on the Snyder engineering plan, based on the conversations that the pipeline technicians had with the project engineer, that was the understanding that they had as to the furthest extent channelward or shoreward the dredging would occur.
Okay, so per Enterprise's procedures and policies, would that distance have caused any concern or triggered automatic marking of the pipeline?
60 feet, no. Their damage prevention program requires 50 feet. So anything inside of 50 feet would have triggered the need for compulsory marking. Exactly.
So my next question is 50 feet enough clearance?
That's difficult to say. If tolerance zones are determined to be greater than that, then no.
Yeah. So is there any regulatory or industry standard for clearance distances and tolerance zones?
No, sir. Only with respect to, as we mentioned, on land situations. It's regulated state to state. Every state has a tolerance zone requirement in their state regulations, and they generally run from 18 inches to 30 inches.
And that's basically for land. It doesn't cover water.
There are at least 2 states, to my knowledge, that do have some provisions for submerged pipelines, 15 feet, I believe, in North and South Carolina. But to my knowledge, there are no others.
Do we have any recommendations out there for this?
Well, our recommendation is for PHMSA and the 2 organizations to work together to, it would be to PHMSA to include criteria for minimum tolerance and safety zones in their state program evaluation. So it would be left state to state to develop an appropriate tolerance zone.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll yield back, and I have more questions in this area. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. I don't have much in this area. I really just want to follow up a little bit on some of the questions that have already been asked, and also just kind of clarify my own understanding. So again, tolerance zones are those are defined areas where no mechanical excavation should occur near a pipeline, and that could be on land or underwater, depending on the location of the pipeline. And what I believe you just said, there are no federal regulations with respect to defining appropriate tolerance zones, correct?
That's correct. And
to the extent that there are regulations on the state level, those vary considerably?
Well, between 18 and 30 inches, neither of which is appropriate for a dredging situation.
And by and large, that's for land, not underwater.
Correct.
And again, your point is inappropriate for dredging circumstances. And industry best practices, it sounds like there really isn't an industry best practice. There's a wide range of practices with respect to what appropriate tolerance zones should be, particularly with respect to underwater dredging.
I think that's an accurate assessment, yes.
Now, I think you told us earlier the courtesy marking of the pipeline in this case was not intended to ensure safety with respect to dredging. It was intended to be helpful with respect to placement of the anchors, correct?
Yes, sir.
I gather that the dredging template that was loaded into the Dredge Pack software included not just the so-called box, but also included the slope. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
But that was never provided to the pipeline operator.
You're right. The pipeline operator did not have access to the dredge template.
And I don't know, I know very little about how these softwares work, but I'm going to guess that it could and should have been possible for that information from the software, directly from the software, to have been provided to the, in some format, to the pipeline operator, so that the pipeline operator could have seen what was specifically what was intended, and there could have been some consultation. Is that right?
Yes. And not only that, we have a proposed recommendation for white lining requirements as well. And so that would communicate the excavators or the dredgers' intentions to the pipeline technicians by placing physical markers at a site prior to making a one-call notification. It would be an extra added way of communicating where they intend to dredge. And in this case, that could have altered the assessment on the one call.
Yeah, because sadly, it seems like it wouldn't have required a lot of additional effort here to provide much more precise information to the pipeline operator. So the pipeline operator could have said, wait a minute, we need to talk about this. We need to make sure we're keeping a safe distance from this pipeline. Very, very unfortunate. I have no more questions in this area. Thank you very much to our staff.
Thank you. Mr. Stansel, what are the leading causes of pipeline ruptures and leaks? Top two.
Third-party damage and corrosion.
Yeah. So third-party damage, outside force damage, excavation. And according to PHMSA data, most of these failures are the result of third-party damage. And what we mean by third-party damage is that someone else other than the pipeline operator caused it, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And that's why we have 811. What has 811 one call done for these to prevent these type of ruptures and leaks? Since it's 811, I think goes back to 2005, but really was in development far earlier than that, between work we did and the Common Ground Alliance and Office of Pipeline Safety. But
well, it all goes down to communication of intent to dig in an area. The one call center very quickly identifies utilities in an area, not just pipelines, but other utilities, and notifies the utility operators of someone's intent to excavate possibly within their area. They forward what's called a one call ticket to a recipient, a designated recipient for each of these organizations, and the organizations then are responsible within 48 hours of reviewing the one call ticket, contacting the excavator, and determining whether their utilities are going to be impacted. And if so, then they're responsible for marking the utilities and taking other appropriate protective actions.
And you mentioned that Enterprise was of the understanding that the work was being done 55 to 60 feet off the pipeline. So that's the information they had. Would you think it's unreasonable, and I do, but do you think it's unreasonable to require a pipeline company to conduct engineering analysis every time there's work around their pipeline?
Well, that wouldn't be possible for the number of pipeline one-call notices that a company receives. These technicians were doing dozens of one-call reviews each week. There's some figure that I think we've cited either, I don't believe it's in this report, but it might be in the group factual report. Thousands of one-call notices enterprises responded to within a short period of time.
Right. Can you pull up slide 51? So, and I just want to understand this, Mr. Stansel. Actually, can you go one before that? Okay, so pipeline was not marked for excavation damage avoidance, and I just want to clarify this one line here. At some point, Orion contacted Enterprise through 811, and they issued an all clear because they were under the understanding that these dredging operations were 55 to 60 feet off of their pipeline, correct?
Yes, by the beginning of July, the one-call ticket was closed out as clear, and the pipeline status was indicated as not marked.
And so Orion called Enterprise back, and so Enterprise then came out and marked the pipeline on July 16th. Did Enterprise have to do that?
They did not. Based on the information that they had originally been provided, they did not. But they did come out. They met that time in person with the project engineer, and the information did not change from the previous one-call communication.
So 9 days after the cane poles were placed to mark the pipeline, a Category 1 hurricane struck the Texas coast just south of Corpus Christi. Is there any indication that the hurricane may have blown away some of the cane poles?
Well, we have a pre-accident photograph taken by Epic showing that there was one cane pole that was not there post-accident. We do not know whether the hurricane was responsible for that, whether it was damaged in the fire and explosion, or whether for some other reason it was disturbed or removed. But the cane pole closest to the accident site was missing post-accident.
So Orion says that it's Enterprise's responsibility after a hurricane to just go out and remark the pipeline that they didn't have to mark in the first place. Whose responsibility is it to contact 811 again after a hurricane to remark the pipeline or make sure that all the markings are there?
Well, the state regulations, the Texas Railroad Commission regulations, state that it's the excavator's responsibility to notify the pipeline company or to file a second one call if they determine that facilities are unmarked or if markers require refreshment because of damage or that they turn up missing. before conducting any work in that area.
Apparently, I'm way over time. I am so sorry to my colleagues. I did not know that. So Paul, I'm going to stop and allow my colleagues to just ask questions. I apologize. I did not see my timer. So Member Graham, use the time you need. Member Chapman and Vice Chairman Landsberg, did you have additional questions?
I do, Chair.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I
You
apologize.
were on a roll, so I understand.
Sorry.
So there was a submission by one of the parties, Orion, that stated that the pipeline was not being properly maintained. So 2 questions. Was shoreline erosion or loss of surrounding dirt and rock a contributory factor? And would it have made any difference had the pipeline been covered with additional layers of dirt?
We pointed out in the report that the area where the pipeline, where the damage occurred, had been subjected to erosion, some significant erosion since the time the pipeline was initially installed. And so there's a photograph in the report demonstrating that. We eliminated pipeline cover as a contributory or causal factor because the pipeline was struck from underneath. The punctures occurred at the 7 o'clock position on the pipe. So with the cutter head approaching the pipe from underneath, it would not have mattered how much cover was over the pipeline. It would have quickly been suctioned away by the cutter head, and there would have been no difference in the outcome.
Did the investigation reveal any discrepancies in the maintenance of the pipeline?
No, sir, it did not. We looked at pipeline integrity management. There were no indications of metal loss, dents, damage, cracks, corrosion in the area near where the incident occurred, and there were no unresolved maintenance issues on that pipeline system.
Thank you. The Texas General Land Office, which is tasked with erosion control, noted that the average erosion rate for the Texas shoreline is about 4 feet per year, but it can be much greater. How might the erosion problem in terms of marking and protecting pipelines relate to this situation?
Well, it could certainly damage pipeline markings. They're temporary markings and as well permanent markings. In this case, there were some permanent markers on either side of the waterborne section of this pipeline, or the submerged section of this pipeline, that turned out to have been downed, were found down after the accident. We don't know if that was because of the hurricane or because of the accident itself.
Okay, well, thank you. Chair Hominy, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair. I got a question about a couple questions on dredge area pre-marking. I think we all know that pre-marking and excavation on the land is done with marking and white lines for that area. How would one pre-mark a proposed dredge area in the water?
It could have been done the exact same way that the pipeline itself was marked. It could have been done in this case because the pipelines were in shallow water. Cane poles could have been used to mark the extent of the dredge template. That also could have been marked with buoys in deeper water with buoys, or coordinates, location coordinates could have been provided to indicate that. So we would say the same exact way or methods that can be used to mark pipelines can be used to do white lining.
Okay. Is there a standard for that?
There is a standard for on land. It requires white paint and flags, but there's really no guidance as to what to do in marine environments, which is, why we're making that recommendation.
Excellent. Yes, we're making that recommendation. And who would be required to do the pre-marking of a of a dredge area, would that be the excavator or the pipeline company?
The excavator. So the area would be pre-marked before the one call notice was made. And then when the pipeline technicians come out to evaluate the one call, they can see that there's visual evidence as to where they intend to do the dredging or excavation. And that way it calibrates the communication. Everybody understands where the dredging is going to occur.
So Orion could have helped their own cause to let Enterprise know exactly the extent of their dredge area.
Well, this is a practice that we've cited before in safety studies going back to 1997. We believe that it helps to prevent accidents, and it should be extended to marine projects as well.
Exactly. Thank you for that. One quick question on courtesy markings. Is there an industry standard for courtesy marking?
No, sir, there's not. I think I'm not sure how many companies do this sort of thing. It may be particular to Enterprise, but there's no standard practice for that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you for that. And Chair, I have no more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Chapman.
No questions from me, Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Stansel, just following up on where we left off. You had mentioned that Texas state law requires Orion to notify Enterprise if there was a change in status with the cane poles or any other pipeline marking. So that was on Orion after the hurricane. Is that what you were saying?
If there were markings that were removed or damaged or missing, it would be incumbent upon the excavator to notify the one call center, file a second one call notice. Yep. To request refreshment of the pipeline markers.
Okay, great. That's all I have in this section. Are there any other issues that board members would like to discuss related to this investigation? Okay, I do have a couple. I want to turn to Orion Group Holdings party submission. And I tell, like Member Graham had indicated, I am really shocked by this party statement, this party submission to the NTSB. The party submission, I'm just going to go down the areas that they say where the fault lies here, or the safety issues lie here, the safety deficiencies. They say Enterprise failed to maintain the subject liquid propane pipeline in a safe condition. Mr. Stansel, you had just stated there were no integrity or corrosion issues with the pipeline in our that we identified in our investigation, correct?
That's correct.
In fact, PHMSA regulations require Enterprise to conduct inline inspection of its pipelines once every 5 years. When was this pipeline last inspected?
2016.
Any anomalies?
None reported in the area where the accident occurred. There were a number of indications, but none which required repair. Okay.
And has Enterprise experienced an unintentional release or near miss accident on this pipeline, at least in the last 10 years?
No, there are none recorded for this pipeline.
Okay. So the submission, the party submission by Orion also says Enterprise failed to properly assess and act on the risk the pipeline presented when its cover was lost on the shoreline as the shoreline moved, uncovering the pipeline. We know that's not the case. Did the investigation find, and you just told Vice Chairman Landsberg that the cover wasn't the issue, and you identified that because of where the pipeline was struck in the 7 o'clock position. There were 5 gouges, 3 dents, 2 punctures at the 7 o'clock position. and that puncture was underneath the pipeline.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, and you also mentioned that any amount of cover would have quickly been vacuumed away by the suction cutter head, correct?
Correct.
Another statement by Orion says Enterprise failed to request to have a representative on board the Waymon Boyd during the subject dredging operations. You said, whose responsibility is that to ask for Enterprise to do that?
Well, it would be the excavator or the dredger. First of all, Enterprise needs to be notified when they're dredging near the pipeline, and they didn't receive such notification.
Pipelines weren't discussed in pre-meetings, they weren't discussed in safety meetings, they weren't in the site-specific safety plan, they weren't in the job hazard assessment, and there was no risk management program. Enterprise, the Orion Group Holdings state party submission says Enterprise failed to follow up with or otherwise ensure a proposed bulkhead and fill. We know, based on your discussions with the other members, that Epic did propose something. Whose responsibility is it to identify and mitigate risk to the pipeline under Texas state regulations before excavation operations occurs?
Well, it would be the excavator.
Orion. Again, and then in another area, it says Enterprise identified hazards based only on an inadequate site inspection and or failure data. Any evidence to suggest that?
The communications are documented in the one-call record and the emails associated with that. The communications were clear that the activity would be 60 feet from the pipeline.
Which wasn't the case. It wasn't the case because that was the information that Orion provided to Enterprise. The party submission says Enterprise failed to adequately mark their pipeline and to ensure their markings were still in place after the passage of Hurricane Hannah shortly after the pipeline is marked. We just had that discussion. It's not Enterprise's responsibility under Texas law. That's the responsibility of Orion. And two other areas that the party, one other area the party submission mentions is the one that member Graham brought up, which is they say hazard identification is a critical step in any risk assessment. Identifying hazards, particularly risk, high risk, low frequency risk cannot typically be accomplished via a review of a particular pipeline history. It requires a diverse team of participants from a variety of disciplines. Again, member Graham question on this. Of course, we agree with that. Perhaps Orion should have had their own hazard identification and risk assessment program. What's not mentioned in Orion's party statement, which does bother me, is any sort of responsibility here, any sort of safety deficiencies that they contributed to. What's also not mentioned are the lives lost, the serious injuries, the families that are forever shattered, and multiple organizational failures here, I believe, on the part of Orion Marine Group. So with that, we're going to take, well, first, before we take a break, I want to make sure my colleagues also don't want to ask any, or if they have any other questions. All right, we're going to take a 10-minute break. Before we do that, I'd like to ask all participants to turn their cameras off and their microphones. We'll reconvene at 12:05. Thanks very much. Okay, we're back in session. Before we move on to the reading of the proposed findings, do any of my colleagues have any additional questions or comments on the presentations or the draft report? All right, seeing none. Mr. Curtis, will you please read the proposed findings?
Certainly, Chair. As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 17 findings. Number 1, none of the following were safety issues for the accident. 1, personnel experience and qualifications of the equipment operators. 2, fatigue. 3, distraction from cell phone use. 4, vessel mechanical and electrical systems failures. 5, environmental conditions. 6, leak detection systems on pipeline TX219. 7, pipeline operating history and operating pressure. 8, pipeline integrity. 9, transport of non-odorized propane in the pipeline. Or 10, pipeline depth of cover. Number 2, Enterprise's pipeline TX219 was struck by the dredge Waymon Boyd's rotating cutter head, causing a breach in the line that allowed propane to escape and form a gas cloud that surrounded the dredge. Number 3, propane gas that had released from pipeline TX219 was drawn into the Waymon Boyd's engine room by the ventilation fans and was ignited, causing the explosion. Number 4, the Enterprise pipeline controllers and pipeline technicians' actions to secure the pipeline were appropriate and facilitated a timely shutdown. Number 5, given the GPS margin of error, potential inaccuracies in the dredge configuration information, and the resolution of the dredge pack display, the dredging area specified in the Schneider Engineering and Consulting plans was too close to pipeline TX219 for safe excavation using a cutterhead dredge. Number 6, Orion Marine Group did not have adequate procedures to require that pipelines be identified and included in dredge pack. Thus, the Waymon Boyd's leverman was unaware how close he was operating the cutterhead to the pipeline. Number 7, Orion Marine Group's planning and risk management process was inadequate, which resulted in their failure to identify and mitigate the risk of a cutterhead impact with pipeline TX219. Number 8, the Schneider Engineering and Consulting plans provided to Orion Marine Group for the Epic Dock project were deficient because they did not clearly depict the extent of the dredging area or the pipeline location in all drawings, which resulted in the Orion Marine Group project engineer misinterpreting the information, overestimating the distance between the dredge area and pipeline TX219, and communicating incomplete and inaccurate information during the one-call process, which dissuaded Enterprise from protecting the pipeline TX219 in accordance with the company's damage prevention program. Number 9, marine dredging projects require a greater level of collaboration and review between pipeline operators and dredging companies that the one-call process provides because of the challenges associated with marking marine pipelines and the lack of precision associated with dredging operations. Number 10, third-party damage prevention efforts would be improved if pipeline operators provided dredging companies accurate location data for pipelines within and near dredging project boundaries to incorporate into dredge control software files. Number 11, although Enterprise courtesy marked the pipelines with cane poles, they did not meet pipeline excavation damage protection standards and therefore were insufficient to visually warn the leverman of the danger of the pipeline. Number 12, project boundary marking requirements for dredging projects, equivalent to land-based white lining requirements, would provide utility operators with additional visual information about the location of dredging projects to confirm any encroachment of the proposed project on pipelines. Number 13, the clearance required by existing state-regulated tolerance zones is not adequate for large-scale dredging activities because of the inherent inaccuracies associated with operating a cutterhead dredge. Number 14, the Enterprise Damage Prevention Program did not provide for an adequate tolerance zone for dredging projects. Number 15, written policies and procedures could have eliminated confusion about the pipeline TX219 location and minimum tolerance distances for pipeline damage prevention. Number 16, because Schneider Engineering and Consulting did not have company specifications, quality control measures, or best practices for including pipeline hazards and tolerance zones in their engineering plans and drawings, the engineering plans and drawings did not clearly reflect the proximity of the pipeline to the full dredging area. And number 17, the dredge crew lacked function-specific pipeline safety training and emergency procedures that could have prepared them to react quicker and more effectively to the gas pipeline strike. Chair?
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. At this time, we'll do a roll call to make sure that all members are ready to deliberate. Vice Chairman Landsberg. Member Graham? Oh, sorry, Vice Chairman Landsberg.
I'm ready to deliberate.
Member Graham.
I'm standing by to deliberate also.
Member Chapman.
Standing by, Chair.
Are there any questions on or amendments to the proposed findings? Okay, I have 3 amendments. I will start. I have a amendment to finding number 1. And my amendment would strike the first reference to the word personnel and then strike the words equipment operators and insert the words vessel and pipeline personnel. The amendment has been moved. Is there a
Second.
second? Thank you. Discussion on the amendment. I will start and mention why I am offering this amendment. Currently, the amendment or the finding 1 states that none of the following were safety issues for the accident. 1, personnel experience and qualifications of the equipment operators. I think and during questioning, we discussed the actions of pipeline personnel. And so I wanted to make sure that we mention both vessel and pipeline personnel. And by just stating equipment operators, the pipeline personnel that were involved were beyond just equipment operators. They were pipeline controllers and gas technicians. So equipment operators doesn't really address those personnel. Further discussion? Nope. Okay, thank you. Does staff have a position on the proposed amendment?
Thank you, Chair Hamady. Staff had an opportunity to review the proposed amendment, and we believe the change to finding number 1 is helpful, and we concur.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Terrell. Any further discussion on the amendment? All right, the motion to amend finding 1 has been seconded by Member Graham, and we'll now conduct a roll call vote. We'll go one by one. Those in favor say aye. If opposed, say nay. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
Chair votes aye. The motion to amend finding 1 is approved. Okay, so I also have an amendment to finding 10. Finding 10 currently, my amendment would strike the words pipeline operators provided and insert after the words dredging companies, the word obtained. And then after accurate location data, insert the words from pipeline operators. So it would read, third-party damage prevention efforts would be improved if dredging companies obtained accurate location data from pipeline operators for pipelines within and near dredging project boundaries to incorporate into dredge control software files. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you very much, Vice Chairman Landsberg. Discussion on the amendment. So my amendment is just putting in place again what we discussed, which was it is the dredging company's project and it is their responsibility to obtain accurate location data from pipeline operators for pipelines within and near a dredging project, especially before a one-call notification. And so that is why I've offered this amendment. Further discussion? All right, does staff have a position on the proposed amendment?
Thank you, Chair Hamady. The amendment provides clarity and staff concurs with the proposed amendment.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? No? Okay, so the motion to amend finding 10 has been seconded by Vice Chairman Landsberg, and we'll conduct a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
Chair votes aye, and the motion to amend finding 10 is approved. I have one final amendment, but before I pursue that, I just want to make sure, do others have any amendments so far? Okay, so motion to amend finding 11. It would amend finding 11 would now read, although Enterprise courtesy marked the pipelines with cane poles, they did not meet pipeline excavation damage protection standards, nor were they required to based on the incorrect information provided by Orion, and therefore were insufficient to visually warn the leverman of the danger of the pipeline. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Member Graham. Discussion on the amendment. I wanted to make sure that it was clear. It's clear in the discussion that precedes this and the analysis that although there was courtesy marking, there wasn't a requirement to do marking and therefore not a requirement to meet standards. But I'm a little bit concerned that if you just read the findings and don't read all the rest of the report, that won't be clear, so I wanted to clarify it. Any discussion?
I think it's an excellent addition to the finding. And as a matter of fact, I was contemplating a change to that when you sent this out last night. So I think it's excellent and I support it.
Thank you, Member Graham.
Chair, I want to suggest just a very slight tweak to the finding because I think it's a little bit unclear whether we're referring to Enterprise as being required to do something or the markers being required to do something. I wonder if it might read better if it said, although Enterprise courtesy marked the pipelines with cane poles, the markers did not meet pipeline excavation damage protection standards. So I would propose to strike they in the second line and insert the markers.
All right. Before I withdraw my amendment and reoffer my amendment, can I ask the staff to what their position is on the amendment, including the minor change that Member Chapman mentioned, which I think is a good change, but go ahead.
Chair, thank you. The change improves finding number 11. Staff concurs, but I think I would like to check with Paul Stansel one last time here to make sure. Paul Stansel.
Yes, I concur. I think changing the word they sort of gives specificity to it. We're not talking about enterprise, we're talking about the markers themselves. So that is correct.
Yes, Chair, we concur. Thank you.
Okay, great. So the finding would now read, although Enterprise courtesy marked the pipelines with cane poles, the markers did not meet pipeline excavation damage protection standards, nor were they required to based on the incorrect information provided by Orion, and therefore were insufficient to visually warn the leverman of the danger of the pipeline. Can I ask Ms. Silba, Shion, pop up?
Good afternoon.
Procedurally, should I withdraw my amendment, reoffer? Or
I think
can I
that can
amend
be
that?
a friendly, I think that can be a friendly change to yours.
Okay.
Unless Member Chapman prefers to have it as a secondary, then no, I think that you can do it as a combined to yours.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right, so we have any further discussion on the amended amendment, the changed amendment, corrected amendment. All right, so we'll go to a vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
Chair votes aye. And the motion to amend finding 11 is approved. And thank you very much for improving that, Member Chapman. It's a good change. Are there any other amendments to or further discussion on the findings? No? All right. Then we're going to go back to Mr. Curtis. Will you? Sorry about that. We have to adopt the findings. So do I hear a motion to adopt the findings
So moved.
as revised?
So
Second?
moved.
Second.
Moved by Vice Chairman Landsberg, seconded by Member Chapman, and we'll go to a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
Chair votes aye, and the findings as amended are approved. Mr. Curtis, will you please read the proposed probable cause?
Certainly, Chair. The staff proposes the following probable cause. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the hazardous liquid pipeline breach, propane release, and subsequent explosion and fire aboard the dredging vessel Waymon Boyd was Orion Marine Group's inadequate planning and risk management processes, which failed to identify the proximity of their dredging operation to Enterprise Products Pipeline TX219 and resulted in the absence of effective controls to prevent the dredge's cutterhead from striking the pipeline. Contributing to the accident were deficient dredging plans provided by Schneider Engineering and Consulting, which resulted in incomplete and inaccurate information communicated to Enterprise Products by Orion Marine Group during the one-call process, which resulted in insufficient measures to protect the pipeline from excavation damage. Chair?
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Are there any amendments to the probable cause? No? Do we have a motion to adopt the probable cause?
So moved.
Second.
So we'll proceed to a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
Chair votes aye. The probable cause as proposed has passed as presented. So we will now move on to recommendations. Mr. Curtis.
As a result of the investigation, staff proposes the following 10 new safety recommendations. 3 to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Number 1, in collaboration with coastal and marine operators and the Council for Dredging and Marine Construction Safety, develop recommended practices and processes for pipeline operators and dredging companies to obtain and use accurate pipeline location data during planning and one-call locating activities for pipelines both in and near project locations. Number 2, in collaboration with coastal and marine operators and the Council for Dredging and Marine Construction Safety, develop guidance for excavators to clearly identify proposed dredging boundaries for dredging projects before notifying one-call centers by either physically marking the boundaries where practicable or identifying the boundary with accurate location data. Number 3, include criteria for minimum tolerance or safety zones for dredging in state program evaluation guidelines. One recommendation to coastal and marine operators. Number 4, modify the existing working safely near underwater pipelines online pipeline safety training to incorporate lessons learned from this accident. 2 recommendations to coastal and marine operators and the Council for Dredging and Marine Construction Safety. Number 5, work with the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to develop recommended practices and processes for pipeline operators and dredging companies to obtain and use accurate pipeline coordinates during planning and one-call locating activities for pipelines both in and near project locations. Number 6, work with the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to develop guidance for excavators to clearly identify proposed dredging boundaries for dredging projects before notifying one-call centers by either physically marking the boundaries where practicable or identifying the boundary with accurate location data. 3 recommendations to Orion Group Holdings. Number 7, require Orion Marine Group 2 for all future dredging projects conduct a formal documented risk assessment with risk analysis, such as a risk matrix, before starting work, and based on the risk assessment, develop a hazard control plan. Number 8, require Orion Marine Group to develop standardized written policies and procedures for planning dredging operations near pipelines that include pipeline operator engagement on pipeline avoidance measures, minimum tolerance zones, minimum requirements for marking and verifying pipelines, and uploading of pipeline information into DredgePack or other navigation software. Number 9, require Schneider Engineering and Consulting to develop specifications and quality control measures to ensure pipeline and other hazard data is included and clearly represented in engineering plans and drawings to include depicting tolerance distances from underwater pipelines. And 1 recommendation to Enterprise Products. Number 10, revise your damage prevention program guidelines to include a larger tolerance zone for dredging operations. Chair?
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Are there any amendments to the recommendations as proposed? I have one amendment to recommendation 3 to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. The amendment would add the words pipeline safety between the words state and program. So it would read, include criteria for minimum tolerance or safety zones for dredging in state pipeline safety program evaluation guidelines. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Landsberg. And just quick discussion, it's just to clarify that it's the state pipeline safety program evaluation. Certain states have certifications, other states have agreements with PHMSA to conduct oversight over intra and interstate natural gas and hazardous liquid pipelines. So I just wanted to clarify that we mean the state pipeline safety program evaluation. Further, just anybody else want to comment? No? Okay. Does staff have a position on the proposed amendment?
Thank you, Chair Hamady. Staff concurs. Thank you.
Thank you. So the motion to amend recommendation 3 was seconded by Vice Chairman Landsberg. So we'll go to a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
And the chair votes aye. So the vote to amend recommendation 3 is approved. Are there any other amendments to the recommendations or further discussion on the recommendation? Is there a motion to adopt the recommendations as amended?
So moved.
Moved by Member Graham and seconded by Vice Chairman Landsberg. The motion to adopt the recommendations as amended has been seconded again by Vice Chairman Landsberg. So Vice Chairman Landsberg, we'll go to you. Aye. Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
And the chair votes aye. So the vote is unanimously approved to adopt the recommendations as amended. Does any member have any additional issues for discussions before we move to the adoption of the final report? All right, is there a motion to adopt the final report as revised?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. So we'll go to a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman. Sorry, one more time.
Aye.
The chair votes aye. The vote to approve the report as revised has been approved. Do any members wish to reserve the right to file a concurring or dissenting statement? All right. Well, with that, our deliberations have now come to an end. I want to thank my colleagues on the board for your preparation going into the board meeting and for the discussion today. I thought the discussion was excellent, but I can't help thinking we should never have to meet like this. The pipeline strike, explosion, and fire were preventable had Orion Marine Group properly planned for the project, ensuring appropriate policies and procedures were in place to protect their workers and the public, identified and mitigated any risks before the project began, and conducted appropriate training. That didn't occur, and 4 workers paid the price with their lives. 5 others suffered serious injuries, and families are forever shattered. It is absolutely critical that when excavators conduct any dredging operations near underwater pipelines, that proper precautions are in place to ensure safety. In fact, the One Call program was created because excavation damage and outside force damage are the leading causes of pipeline incidents, underscoring the importance of knowing what's below. The One Call program is probably the most significant improvement in the history of pipeline safety regulation, having saved countless lives, but it's only effective when used properly. With that, on behalf of the board, I want to thank once again the U.S. Coast Guard, as well as our safety partners at the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, our colleagues in the Office of Marine Safety, the Office of Railroad Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Investigations, the Office of Research and Engineering, and the Office of General Counsel for their work over the course of this investigation and the development of an excellent report. We also want to thank our colleagues in the NTSB's Transportation Disaster Assistance Division who coordinate resources and information for survivors, families, and friends of those involved in the tragedies that we investigate. Our colleagues in the Office of Administration, Office of Chief Information Officer, and the Digital Services Division for supporting this board meeting. And finally, our colleagues in the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications, who work hard to ensure our recommendations are implemented. The recommendations we've issued today, when acted upon, will improve the safety of dredging operations around underwater pipelines and will save lives. We look forward to working with our partners in safety as they implement these recommendations. We stand adjourned.